600,000 Americans and 7.5 million Japanese. Those 8 million people weren't added to the official fatality count of World War II because they were spared from death through the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, putting the bloodiest conflict in human history to a close. While the nuclear bombings were seen as an exceptionally brutal way of forcing Japan into surrender, it was the most humane path that the US could have taken. The only other option that the US could have taken would have been to initiate Operation Downfall, which, in short, was a full-scale invasion into the Japanese homeland. Of course, this scenario never played out, but let's imagine a scenario where Operation Downfall did go into effect, and the United States mounted an invasion into the heartland of the Empire of Japan. First, let's discuss how the scenario could have come into effect in the first place, which in all honesty, wouldn't be that difficult to happen. After the Manhattan Project bore fruit in New Mexico, President Truman was presented with two options of either using the atomic bomb or initiating Operation Downfall. In our timeline, Truman decided to go with the bomb, as he saw it as a means of ending the war in a quicker fashion. In this scenario, I could still see Truman using the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the only difference is that the Japanese custom of never surrendering would play in, and the Japanese would refuse to surrender even in the face of nuclear annihilation. This isn't unrealistic at all, as many top-tier generals in Japan, such as Kenji Doihara, were willing to continue fighting the Allies even if the imperial capital city of Tokyo were to be obliterated via atomic bombing. While more nukes and firebombs could possibly be dropped on the Japanese cities of Kokura or Kyoto, this wouldn't be enough to crack the Japanese mentality of never surrendering, and the call to send American troops on Japanese soil would commence. Operation Downfall has officially begun. Using the islands of Okinawa as a forward base, the Americans would commence an amphibious landing at Kyushu, similar to the D-Day landings in Normandy, except upscaled by about 25%. At the same time, a great American fleet would have arrived in eastern Kanto, with the Americans forcing their way down to Tokyo with the intention of capturing Emperor Hirohito. During this time period in Japanese history, the emperor was regarded with similar status as a god, so the Americans would know that if the emperor were to fall into their hands, the main pillar of Japanese morale would collapse. While this is all going on, the Soviet Union would undoubtedly be making massive strides to capture as much land as possible. The Soviets would have already commenced this operation when the initial nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and would have been able to capture much more land by now than in our timeline due to Operation Downfall elongating the war. I could see the Soviets sweeping through Japanese-held Manchuria and making their way down to the southern coast of the Korean peninsula. The Kuril Islands, along with southern Sakhalin, would have easily been taken by the Soviets, and they would face no issue taking Hokkaido with the intention to subjugate all of northern Japan. In our timeline, the Soviet Union was only able to capture the Kuril Islands, along with a large part of Manchuria, due to the Japanese officially laying down arms only a week after Nagasaki was nuked. In this timeline, since the war would be dragged on for many more months or even years, the Soviets would have enough time to capture much more land in Eastern Asia, with it even being possible to capture and occupy Shandong or even as far south as Jiangsu. Meanwhile, on the American side, since the Americans wouldn't be able to navigate through the unfamiliar Japanese countryside, their push to take Tokyo would be halted and forced into a stalemate after conquering Kyushu. In order to continue their press through Japan and get to Tokyo, I would imagine that chemical warfare against the Japanese would be initiated in order to debilitate both the Japanese populace and their food supply. In our timeline, chemical weapons were stockpiled in the American-occupied Marianas with the intention to use them against Japan, and due to the predictable Japanese wind patterns, the nation was particularly vulnerable to gas attacks. Although chemical warfare was outlawed by the Geneva Protocol, neither the US nor Japan was a signatory of it at the time. Along with that, Japan had already used chemical weapons against China a few years prior, which could give the Americans a justifiable reason to initiate such attacks. Because of these reasons, I would expect that the Japanese would be subject to American chemical attacks, with their food supply in eastern Honshu and southern Kyushu being the main target. Because the Allies would be unable to break the Japanese mentality of fighting to the death, they wouldn't be able to outright force them into capitulation. Rather, the rest of the operation will deal with starving them of resources and dealing one final knockout blow to the heart of Japan. For the majority of the war, the Japanese were able to fuel the war machine through the developed resources of raw materials and heavy industry in the colonies that they established in Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria. They would be unable to do that by this point, as the Soviets have already established their dominance in Eastern Asia, and the Americans would block any Japanese ships from reaching Taiwan. When it comes to a final knockout blow to Japan, I would expect this to come in the form of air raids, or even possibly more nuclear strikes on Japanese cities, with Tokyo being the most likely target. This isn't that far out of the picture, as a great deal of high-ranking American war officials, such as Ken Nichols, the district engineer of the Manhattan Project, wrote that if an invasion of the Japanese home islands were to take place, then the troops would be supported with 15 additional nuclear bombs. The purpose purpose of this was to create airbursts about 600 meters above important Japanese strongholds in order to maximize blast effects while minimizing radiation so that the strongholds can then be occupied. At the same time, the Soviets will have already conquered all of Hokkaido and northern Tohoku, and just like in Germany, the two countries would be invading the same country on opposite ends, with it now being a race to the capital. By this point, the Japanese would see the writing on the wall and would sue for peace, as the country has lost tens of millions of lives throughout the war, and the imperial house is now under threat. So before the Americans could reach Tokyo and capture the emperor, I would expect that Hirohito would call out that Japan has surrendered to the Allies and that Japanese arms have been laid down. After years of fighting, and tens of millions of lives lost throughout both conflict and genocide, the Second World War has officially come to a close, with the surrender of the Empire of Japan. Just like in our timeline, the entirety of Japan would be put under occupation, but unlike our timeline, the Americans wouldn't have as much of a say over how to deal with post-war Japan, China, or even Korea. This is because the Soviets would have already invested hundreds of thousands of their troops into taking all of Korea, most of eastern China, and basically all of northern Japan. Because of this, I would expect that Japan would be split between a Soviet-occupied Hokkaido and Tohoku and an American-occupied South. Just like Germany's capital city of Berlin, Japan's capital city of Tokyo would be put under Allied occupation, with the US and Soviet Union receiving the lion's share of the city. Britain and France might occupy a tiny part of Tokyo, but would have no influence over any other part of the nation. In short, Japan would become the Asian Germany in this timeline, where it was split in half between a capitalist South and communist North, along with the capital coming under joint occupation. When it comes to the fate of Emperor Hirohito, I find it extremely unlikely that he would be executed. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union would begin to break down the same way they did in our timeline by this point, which would make each country want to make Japan a key ally towards their respective causes for geopolitical purposes. If one side were to execute the emperor, the man who the Japanese people saw as a divine figure who manifested Japan itself, that would basically be asking the Japanese people to break out into rebellion against the country who killed their god. Along with that, the influence of the emperor will serve as extremely useful towards getting the Japanese people on the side of either the US or Soviet Union. This is why I would expect the emperor to become a puppet monarch, with both the US and Soviet Union vying for control over his influence. It's hard to say who the rest of the imperial house would support, but another scenario is that the imperial house would stay completely silent when it comes to political matters. This is because the house would know that their status and position is at the hands of the two superpowers, and doing or saying something to offend either one could result in the loss of their lofty position. When it comes to Japanese culture following the war, I wouldn't expect an overly flamboyant version of American culture to exist in this timeline. When we imagine modern Japanese culture, we tend to think of a futuristic form of American culture, with a plethora of robots, glittery lights, and of course, anime. Anime came to be in our timeline due to American troops bringing comics to Japan during the occupation period, which were then adapted by Japanese cartoonists and became what we know of today as anime. I find it hard to think that anime would take such a foothold in this timeline, as many of the great pioneers of anime such as Katsuhiro Otomo are from the northern stretches of Japan. In this timeline, these would-be pioneers wouldn't have access to the American comics and media that they did in our timeline due to living in a Soviet-controlled zone, meaning that the type of anime we see today wouldn't have become as big or might not even exist at all. Meanwhile in Europe, because the US has been directing its efforts towards forcing Japan into submission for a great deal of time after the Nazi regime had already collapsed, the Soviet Union would have already been rebuilding most of post-war Europe into their own image. Despite this, the Soviets wouldn't be able to carry through with all of their European ambitions because the US would still be offering economic support towards European nations distraught by World War II. One minor detail about this is that because George C. Marshall will continue to serve as Chief of Staff of the US Army until the end of the war against Japan, the Marshall Plan wouldn't be named after him, but rather the sitting Secretary of State at the time, James Burns. The Burns Plan would consist of the same economic recovery policies as the Marshall Plan, except that less money would be allocated towards the plan, because the US would still be at war with Japan. In our timeline, the Soviets didn't liberate previously held Nazi territories, but rather occupied them. This is why the US would still send aid to Europe in this timeline, because even though the US would still officially be at war, they wouldn't want a great deal of Europe to come under Soviet domination. In this timeline, the borders of Europe would remain the same as they were in our timeline. The Iron Curtain would still start to cross the borders of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, with the eastern side under communism and the western side under capitalism. In all honesty, when it comes to Europe, there wouldn't be that stark of a contrast between this timeline and our timeline. Instead, the real differences would be present in East Asia. Moving back to that region, let's bring up Korea. In our timeline, the peninsula was divided along the 30th parallel, with the north being communist and the south being anti-communist. In this timeline, there wouldn't be a divide at all, as I would expect all of Korea to come under communism. As I mentioned before, while the land invasion of Japan would be taking place, the Soviets would have swept through the entire Korean peninsula and set up a puppet government there. A region that I would expect to be divided between a communist north and capitalist south isn't Korea, but rather China. In our timeline, China fell under communist rule because the communist rebels led by Mao Zedong were given the Soviet-held region of Manchuria that they then used to conquer the rest of mainland China. In this timeline, the Soviets still would have given the communist Manchuria, along with the coastal Chinese provinces that they took from Japan while Operation Downfall was going on. The US most likely wouldn't want all of China to come under communism, as the region is of extreme strategic importance for their cause. And having already lost Korea and northern Japan, the US would know that they can't afford any more losses in Asia. Because of this, I would expect that a proxy war similar to the Korean War in our timeline would emerge out of the Chinese Civil War, with the Soviet Union supporting the communist base in Beijing, and the US supporting the nationalist base in Hangzhou. Because of the Civil War that had been going on for decades now, along with both sides being supported by the two most powerful countries on Earth, I don't expect one side to come out victorious over the other. Instead, I would expect the fighting to eventually come to a standstill, as both sides would realize that they can't outright defeat the other side. So just like in our timeline with Korea, China would be split into a communist north and capitalist south that are still technically at war with each other, but the actual fighting has ceased years ago. When it comes to the border between these two regions, I would expect that the Yangtze River would serve as a suitable border between the two sides. This is because I would expect most of the actual fighting to take place around the river, so when the boundaries are drawn with the ceasefire, they would most likely be surrounding the river. When it comes to Tibet, the most likely scenario I can imagine for the region would be independence, because of how both sides of China would try and dominate it with equal force to the point where they end up cancelling each other out. Tibet is of utmost importance to both the capitalist and communist side due to one factor: water. Almost all of China's major rivers have sources originating in Tibet. Because of this, if one side were to fully occupy the region, they would be able to starve the other side of water. Both sides would realize this, but wouldn't actually try to take Tibet, as that would just cause the region to pledge its support towards the other side, as it would see the side trying to take it over as invaders. Because of this, I wouldn't actually expect both sides to actually conquer Tibet, but rather try to win over the region's support with political favors and promises. With both sides not wanting to anger Tibet and its people, the Dalai Lama would have no reason to flee to India. Even if the communist Chinese forces were to muster up an invasion of the region, Tibet would know that the capitalist forces would come to their aid, and vice versa. When it comes to the rest of the Cold War post-1950s, it's almost impossible to say how it would play out, except for a few points that happened in our timeline that would still happen in this timeline. Some of these key points include the arms race between the USSR playing out similarly, both nations competing for influence in Europe, and the Vietnam proxy war still occurring. Besides that, one of the biggest notable changes in this timeline would be the absence of the Sino-Soviet split. The reason why the PRC started to turn away from the USSR in our timeline was because Mao and Khrushchev disagreed on how the two communist countries should be run, to the point where Mao felt that it would be better for China to go its own way. In this timeline, this might not be the case due to communist Chinese dependence on the USSR. As I mentioned before, communist China would be similar to North Korea in our timeline, and while it would still most likely possess a formidable military of its own, it would still require support from the Soviet Union if conflict were to break out. Because of this, I would expect that the Sino-Soviet split would be a less dramatic event, or it might not even happen due to the communist Chinese North requiring support against the capitalist Chinese South. Past that, it would be extremely difficult to determine what the world would look like. To summarize this video, the borders of Asia would look extremely different, the USSR would be much more powerful, and the USSR would have a much larger holding in Eastern Asia, and may have a greater level of authority over Europe. Still, the US of Z thanks you for watching, and make sure to check out my channel over in the links below. I enjoyed working on this video with Mr. Z, and I hope that you enjoyed watching it.